Whales are truly amazing animals. Cetacea, the group that contains them, dolphins, and porpoises, are holders of numerous records amongst mammals. Take, for example, the blue whale that reaches 30 meters long, making it the largest animal to ever live. Or the grey whale, which holds the record for the longest mammal migration ever recorded at 14,000 miles. But despite their grandeur, these giants came from humble beginnings. Despite being very well adapted for water, having forelimbs that are flipper-shaped, a streamlined body, and a tail fluke that propels them through the water, it's clear that their origins began on land. Features in modern members, like their need to breathe air and the fact that their embryos still have hind limbs, show that long ago these giants roamed the land. Now, this theory has been around for a while, with the likes of Darwin and even Aristotle suggesting whales came from a terrestrial ancestor. But until recently, fossil evidence didn't support this idea. That was until the 1990s, when multiple fossils coming out of Pakistan and India managed to shed light on this land-to-sea transition. These fossils date to a period known as the Eocene, some 34 to 54 million years ago, a time when this area of the world would have been surrounded by an ancient sea known as the Tethys. And it is in the waters in and around this sea that whales got their start. But in the beginning, they were far from the giants of the modern day. In fact, the earliest known relative of cetaceans was no bigger than a modern house cat. This was a creature called Indohyus, and it was found in rocks that dated to around 50 million years ago. Before the discovery of this animal, whales' relationship to other mammals wasn't exactly clear, with ideas being thrown around that they were related to bears or insectivorous mammals. But genetic studies always placed them as relatives of the artiodactyls. In particular, they put them as having a close relationship with the modern hippo. But for the longest time, there wasn't any fossil material to back this relationship up. That was until 2001, when early whale ankle bones were uncovered that showed a unique double pulley system in their astragalus, which is unique to artiodactyls. So whales are artiodactyls, but despite being their closest living relative, hippos are not the closest relative to modern cetaceans. That honor goes to a group of animals known as Rheoellidae, of which Indohyus is a member. As mentioned earlier, this animal roamed modern-day India 50 million years ago. At this point in time, India was an island in the process of colliding with the rest of Asia, a process that formed the Himalayan mountain range near where the fossil material was found. The rocks that Indohyus was found in indicated that 50 million years ago, they would have been living in a shallow marine environment, and it is clear that this affected the animal's physiology and lifestyle. For a start, Indohyus had very dense bones, a feature that is seen in wading animals like hippos that use them to weigh themselves down in the water. More importantly, Indohyus had an inner ear with a structure that was similar to that of whales. See, this animal had a thickened area of the ear known as an involucrum, which in whales is an adaptation to hearing underwater, as well as being a diagnostic feature of the group. When on land, the ear bones are denser than air, so when sound waves travel through the air and hit the inner ears, they hit the left or right side first, depending where the sound is coming from, before it hits the other. When in water, the ears become the same density as the surroundings, and sound hits them at the same time, making it difficult to tell where the noise is. So, to overcome this, cetaceans developed a thick involucrum to make them denser than water, to restore this normal hearing. Despite this, Indo-Hyas was far from a water-going animal. Isotopic analysis of its teeth showed that it was herbivorous, and the placement of its eyes were reminiscent of modern herbivores, with them facing sidewards. So what could make a small terrestrial mammal want to go into the water? Well, modern animals like muskrats often take to the safety of the water in order to avoid predators. So it is often suggested that Indo-Hyas was doing the same. As well as this, it is suggested that there was more opportunity for food and less competition in the water for the little creature. Whatever the reason, little Indo-Hyas laid the foundations for future relatives that were to become more aquatic. One of these was Ambulocetus from the Middle Eocene. Discovered in Pakistan in 1992, the holotype for Ambulocetus consists of an articulated skull and some postcranial remains, which were found in rocks that also preserved mollusks, suggesting a marine environment. Because of this environment, Ambulocetus took the previously mentioned aquatic features of Indo-Hyas and advanced them. For a start, the hind feet of Ambulocetus were very broad, and its hips had large attachment points for the glute, quad, and tail muscles, all of which were thought to have aided the animal in swimming in a motion similar to otters. It also continued to adapt the inner ear. It retained the dense involucrum seen in its earlier relatives, but it developed what are known as peritympanic sinuses. Now, if you have never heard of them before, that is okay because I had not either. These are air-filled cavities in the skull that prevent the ear bones from connecting to the soft tissues of the head. Why is this a necessity? Well, the soft tissues in the head of whales are roughly the same density as the water they live in, which, as I mentioned, means sound waves hits the ears at the same time, making it hard to tell where the noise is coming from. So, the gaps help to prevent this from happening. Speaking of hearing, Ambulocetus developed another notable adaptation in this department. See, whales do not really use their small external ears to hear, but instead use their jaws. The lower jaws of these animals are very dense and have a connective fat pad that attaches it to the inner ear. Sound vibrations travel along the jaw, across the fat pad, and into the ear. Now, while Ambulocetus does indeed have this dense lower jaw, it is nowhere near as dense as those in later cetaceans. There are several theories as to why this feature evolved, but one of the more accepted is that it helped with hearing not in water, but on land, helping the animal pick up low-frequency vibrations when it held its head to the ground. Yes, because despite all of those adaptations, Ambulocetus was more than capable of living on land, with a strong femur and hip joint that allowed it to support its weight on land, and flexible wrists and ankles. So, with this mosaic of features, how exactly was Ambulocetus living? Well, study of its jaw showed that it was very robust and wide, with powerful muscles associated with closing and interlocking teeth. Couple this with the fact that the nasals and eyes were sat atop its head and that its skeleton was dense, meaning it sunk below the water, it is clear to see that Ambulocetus is a mammalian crocodile. With these adaptations, its lifestyle would have been the same as a crocodile, sitting just below the water, waiting for the large fish, early sirenians, or brontophores that it shared its environment with to walk or swim close enough for it to snatch. But it isn't only crocodiles that early whales were copying. For just a couple of million years later, a genus arose that looked kind of like a gharial. Meet Dalanistes. I say look because this animal and its family Remingtonocetidae probably didn't live in a manner similar to modern gharials. This family is found in India and Pakistan and is characterized by having a long snout, which is often 2/3 the length of the skull. Within these are teeth different from those of its early relatives, but ones that share similarities with later whales like the basilosaurids, which we will talk about later. Basilosaurids have extreme wear on these teeth, so the similarity between the two may be due to both having to chew whatever they were feeding on. However, Dalanistes is slightly different in its skull morphology compared to other Remingtonocetids, in having an unfused mandibular symphysis. This is the joint at the front of the jaw that is responsible for strengthening it. So Dalanistes having an unfused one suggests it probably wasn't feeding on tough food. Differences from other Remingtonocetids include the fact that Dalanistes is 20% larger than other members of the family, sitting at roughly 440 to 1,280 kilograms. What this large body looked like isn't well known, as postcranial remains aren't well known from Dalanistes. But based on other members, it's likely they had short legs and long, powerful tails, suggesting they were well adapted for swimming. This continued swimming lifestyle also meant that Dalanistes and its relatives continued the hearing adaptations built upon by its previous ancestors. Along with having the dense lower jaw, fat pad, and dense ear bones, this family possessed very small semicircular canals in their ears. These canals, when stimulated in any way, are meant to stiffen neck muscles to stabilize it. Stimulation may sound weird, but this basically just means that if the head is moved around. Now, these canals are meant to scale with the size of the animal, but cetaceans, being the giants they are, have relatively small semicircular canals. This is because of a number of reasons, such as the fact that whales have immobile necks that don't need to be stiffened, and the fact that the small canals allow whales to be acrobatic in the water. This means that Dalanistes was probably performing more agile movements in the water. Its further adaptations for hearing likely helped the animal navigate, as not only does it have very small eyes, but it would have also lived in murky water, which is gathered from environmental data. But whales wouldn't be occupying these waters for long, because one group was about to take the leap and leave their ancestral home of India and Pakistan and conquer the world's oceans. These were the Protocetids. By far the group most adapted to life in the water we've seen yet. They possessed a nasal opening high on its head, eyes that faced laterally like modern whales, and a hip joint that wasn't suitable for supporting the animal's weight on land. These adaptations allowed the group to spread across the oceans, with members found in Asia, Europe, North America, and Africa. This latter continent is where we find the focus for this next part, as living in the waters of Egypt some 40 million years ago was a whale called Egyptocetus. Now, it's quite fortunate that we have fossils of this animal, as the holotype was found not in the field, but in a commercial marble mine. The year is 2011, and a paper was published that described Egyptocetus, which was found in a slab of marble that had been sold commercially to Italy from Egypt. Normally, fossils found in commercial marble are disregarded as a defect, but fortunately, the people who found it realized they had something special. The specimen in question had been cut into slabs, but from these were recovered some ribs, vertebrae, and a nearly complete skull. Now, doesn't that look really cool? In fact, this skull is what distinguishes this genus from other protocetids, as the skull of Egyptocetus has a downward-facing rostrum, which is likely an adaptation to feeding. However, it still has a long, narrow skull as in other protocetids. The great preservation of the skull can not only tell us a lot about the genus, but this particular individual, as the teeth within the skull show very little wear. Alongside this, all the bones in it are fused, which means this individual was likely a young adult. Unfortunately, this individual didn't get the chance to grow old, as preserved bite marks on its left side showed that a shark attacked it. Not only did the teeth marks match those made by sharks, but their position is also consistent with how they attack seals. But this wouldn't have been the fate for all members, as this group could still, on occasion, retreat to the land. Now, while postcranial material for Egyptocetus is very limited, other members preserve a lot more, especially one called Myocetus, which preserves not only an adult, but also a juvenile individual still inside the adult's womb. How does this tell us it spent time on land? Well, the head of this fetus was positioned such that it would be the first thing out of the mother. In land mammals, this is beneficial as it means that the animal can breathe during the birthing process. But in the water, if they were to be born this way, it's likely the infant would have drowned. So yeah, while they are very well adapted to life in the water, they weren't quite ready to leave the land behind. But they quickly got over that, as just 1 to 2 million years later, a group would emerge that would be fully aquatic. And with this transition now complete, whales were free to get big. These were the Basilosaurids. This family existed across all of the world's oceans from 33 to 41 million years ago, with their success being attributed to multiple marine adaptations, such as the fact that they had a fully formed blowhole, flippers, and a pelvis that was no longer connected to the body. Over this time, the group was able to adapt to many environments, and came in many different shapes and sizes. One species in particular pushed the size factor, or so we thought. Meet Perocetus colossus. Judging by the name, you can tell that the fossils of this species were obviously found in Peru and consisted of some ribs, a partial pelvis, and vertebra. Even though that isn't a lot of material, from this we were able to tell this animal was unique, as all of these bones were heavy pachyo-osteosclerotic. What does that mean? Well, it means that they were incredibly dense and thick. Now, Perocetus isn't the only basilosaurid to have this condition, as members such as Pachycetus also have it, but Perocetus had it to a much higher degree. So much so that the paper originally describing this skeleton put the skeleton's weight alone at 5 to 7 tons. From this, they gathered that the overall mass of Perocetus would have been anywhere between 85 to 340 tons. This grabbed a lot of headlines when it was first published, as this weight would put it as being the same or heavier than the blue whale, making Perocetus the heaviest animal ever. Why this animal got this big has a couple of theories behind it, but one popular theory is that the size helped Perocetus counteract high energy waves in shallow water. Now, this size would have meant Perocetus would have had to have eaten a lot of food. So what would it have fed on in the shallows? Well, once again, several theories exist. such as that it may have been herbivorous, that it fed on benthic fauna, or was suction feeding on the sea floor. All of which are hard to confirm as the skull for this animal is missing. However, it may not have needed this much food, as the size was later called into question. In 2024, a study was published that reduced the size of Perucetus to around 60 to 70 tons and 17 meters long. And in 2025, this size was reduced even further. The 2025 study stated how previous papers had misjudged the size of Perucetus by using incorrect measurements of blue whales. Previous studies had put the size of this animal at 270 tons and 33 meters long, but the size likely sits at 190 tons and 30 meters long on average. Using these measurements for the blue whale, the 2025 study collected all available measurements and skeletal material for both extant and extinct large marine mammals in order to make 3D models for water displacement to measure their weight. They found that this method was very accurate in estimating their weights, if not slightly overestimating them. So, from this, they put Perucetus at 35 to 40 tons and 15 meters long. This is obviously far less than the measurements for blue whales and puts Perucetus in the range of humpback or grey whales. Still, it is by far the heaviest basilosaurid, and was well on its way to setting a trend of large size seen in this group of mammals, which is another great example of this group adapting to their environment over time. But these aren't the only animals that have changed over time, and if you want to learn about them, then click the video on the screen. Until next time, bye bye.